Hugelmounds and Waterways. I'm going to get into an in-depth discussion today about how we're doing terraforming in this landscape, what the point of it is, and how to design with this sort of earth moving. This is all human scale and pretty small details, very detail driven. Let's talk about it. So what is a Hugelmound anyway? Look it up and I'll also give you my interpretation. The idea is creating relatively large, if not extremely large, raised beds that have very coarse woody debris at the base and ever diminishing size and granularity of material up to the top, and then eventually topped with soil. And the idea behind them is that they create a microclimate or in a situation where the roots of your plants have the option of good drainage but also can get down into water, and that it creates radiant heat, all sorts of good stuff. It's a great use for slash and material. You can see this one is a work in progress that's being made with weeds and debris and prunings, etc. And the reason it's happening here is it's being designed around a keystone species. This is a curly willow or snake willow, which was on this property. I believe this was planted in 1995. So we inherited this beautiful tree. And it's a great element to design a polyculture, to design plant relationships around. So the first order of business was I cut a ton of branches about 5 years ago and stuck them in a ring around this parent tree. These are all cuttings that rooted of this curly willow, and you can see a few years later, pretty significant amount of growth. So multiplying the tree and then also making it easier to get propagation material for me. It's easier to get cuttings from this than the tree way up there. Now, why I would do a Hugelmound and a waterway associated with this tree is because of the wetness of this lawn. So let me talk about the order of operations there and what happened over time. When we first bought this property in 2008, we noticed in the spring, when winter thaw happened, there was very much water sitting in the lawn. Of course, these gardens weren't here. Back then, this was all lawn. But up until May, early June, there was standing water in the middle of the lawn. And so I needed to do something to deal with that. And so what I did was cut a trench that starts right here. This grate is so I can do a wheelbarrow or walk over this without stepping into muck. And this is 4-inch buried perforated pipe, which runs under the ground, through the lawn, around. I put it down before I planted the chestnut, scoops over and heads north to the north and east. And what feeds this water, and by the way, that took care of the standing water. We're in late February. By all accounts, there should be standing water in the yard, and there is not. But the water that feeds that is from this area, so we're going uphill. Now, of course, this trench was not dug out when we were first here. This was just diffusely wet. So I figured, well, I need to trench this a bit. I need to focus the water so that we don't just have this incredibly wet lawn. We have a wet area and a more well-drained area. I have a ton of my nursery production space happening in that area, and if that gets soggy or sodden, some of my plants may die. So upslope of here, there's a cut that brings the water right to the edge of this lawn and comes down this way. So if I want to stack functions, the idea is as I cut that soil to relieve and allow water to come through, what do I do with that soil? And so you can see what I've done is laid slash and woody debris on either side of this waterway. This is a younger version of it. You can see it's a work in progress. These are a little further along. They're capped with soil and rotting wood chips. But basically, raised garden beds, Hugelmounds, can be developed with the minimal amount of hauling soil if I associate them directly to the waterways. Let's take a closer look. We're a little higher upslope in the same common watershed. This actually overflows down through here, past that bamboo, past some hybrid poplars which suck up as much water as they can, and goes to that Hugelmound we were just talking about downslope. You'll notice in here this is also very thoroughly planted out now. There is hazelnut, which have been planted up on lumps, elderberry, there's pawpaws in here, they were planted as understories because we had black walnut in this area and they love black walnut. So wet-loving species, hazelnut not being a wet-loving species, but because I dug this pond to focus the water, I excavated the soil and really built it up directly next to the pond. The root crown of this hazel is in a very well-drained spot, even though it's very close to a pond. It's up on a lump. So the beauty of this is you go from a flat landscape that's kind of wet diffusely at certain times of year and then pretty dry at others, and you make it very well drained in some spots and kind of wet in others. And this is set up to overflow through a trench, which in the late summer dries up enough that it's a walkway, and it can be wick drawn into all these beds that have logs buried in the bottom and rotting debris and soil on top. It's a little weedy in here, etc., but it works. Sometimes I'll lay more coarse wood in the waterway first to let it rot and then bury it later. And then you can see I'm using the nutrients, moisture, and position to root hardwood cuttings. These are Crusader black currants, and I believe I have some willows somewhere in here. These are hardwood cuttings I took a few weeks ago and just stuck into this very rich muck soil, and they don't mind wet-ish feet, although it drains behind them so that they're not flooding, not inundated. But these will produce roots this season, and by next year I can dig them out and they'll be ready to go into an orchard. And you can see there's logs. I mean, that's probably 5 or 6 years old at this point. It's one huge wood chip. But the cuttings don't mind that. I'll guarantee you, or not guarantee you, I'll just tell you that many, many times I've seen hardwood cuttings rooting in relatively young hugelmounds where their roots opted to form into a wood chip or into a log, generally underneath the bark. So not only do they not mind having woody debris in that soil, as long as you've put fertile soil on top, but not only do they not mind, but they seek it out in the dry times of year, and it really helps them. So here is a way of getting a wet area to be a pond, well-drained raised garden beds, a focused nutrient delivery system, and a propagation space for hardwood cuttings in an area that was just kind of mucky and filled with grass and shrubs when we first bought the place. So I'm not going to lie and say that this sort of work is an insignificant amount of work if you're doing it with hand tools. It is a lot of work, but this is what I want to convey. First of all, there was no grand design on paper or on a computer before this all happened. This has been the process of when there's time to do it and when the season seems appropriate, getting out with a $12 shovel and shaving pathways, digging ponds, building raised beds year after year, generally in the off months in the winter, and then planting them out. A lot of times I seed them first to annuals. So in here you can see there's a cover crop of mustards. Maybe I'll put peas or beans or things like that, and then transplanting in the succession. So this is a black currant that is rooted and ready to go. So these raised beds are now pretty well established. They're Menage Shmeru black currant with sage as a companion plant. And we've got sea buckthorn, seaberry, or sea buckthorn I should say, another blue false indigo, there's autumn olive, there's aronia, there's raspberries, there's all sorts of things in here. But that happened over time based on observation, a slow, iterative additioning process, additiulating. Certain areas where the water focuses and it's also in the sun, you could describe this as muck or murky, but what I consider this is a nutrient pool. There's lots of habitat for things to live in under those leaves and sticks. It is also a nursery. I've got iris in the water there. I've got hybrid poplar I'm taking cuttings from, and elderberry plugged in around the sides. And this will be teeming with frogs and toads and that kind of stuff in the summer. Once these hold water enough, I can put feeder goldfish in them, and then that really takes care of mosquitoes and things along that line. But by having all these swales distributing water into the landscape in thoughtful places and having destinations where I need it, I'm going to have more water in certain areas and less in others. That gives me a lot of latitude in what I can plant where.